Hello everyone, this is Dylan Lawrence Moore of the Volitional Science Network. This video today is one that I've wanted to make since the inception of my YouTube channel. It is one of three topics that I consider fundamental to my understanding of intellectual self-defense, the other two being what I call the four circuits of human interaction and the chain of responsibility. The information here is designed to actually be used in tandem with those two other subjects. However, I'm going to be presenting this information here today to be used as a standalone, something that you can take home or take off the video and apply immediately in your life. And I want it to be something immediately practicable and immediately understandable. So for that reason, I'm not going to be using the term that I usually use to describe this concept, which is the 3-2 slip, because we would need to talk about the four circuits of human interaction for you to know what that 3 and 2 referred to. So instead, I'm going to be calling it for this video the line of reason. And this is the line that separates a dominate and submit or win-lose interaction from a reasonable interaction or a win-win. So I've spoken in several previous videos about this line, about the difference between dominating and submitting interactions versus reasonable win-win interactions, but I've never actually explained what exactly that line is, and I will be doing that explicitly here and now. Now, a scientist, whether volitional or natural, never believes that he has the ultimate truth on anything. Instead, he is always, hopefully, progressing towards the truth while never actually reaching it. So in the same way, the ideas that I'm offering in this video, I do so as a starting point for further discussion. Because there's no way for me to talk about something like this without introducing my own bias and my own blind spots. So my hope is that by further discourse, that these ideas can be further refined and better understood and explained by others that could hopefully remove my own bias and my own blind spots. So, to recap, some of the information that I've spoken about in other videos, which is this domination and submit interactions versus reasonable interactions or discussion, is fundamentally, first and most fundamentally, is that it's impossible to have a discussion with somebody who is attempting to dominate you. I literally mean impossible. And here's why. So, I like the example of chess, comparing discussion to chess, because chess has a very specific list of rules. So, there's specific pieces with specific moves and specific ways that we're supposed to take turns and a specific goal for winning the game. Now, it's obviously understood that in order to be playing chess that you have to follow those rules. If somebody starts making up moves or putting pieces back on the board or knocking pieces around, we're not playing chess anymore because we're not following the rules. Well, chess is defined by the rules that govern it. So in the same way, discussion has rules called logic. So if somebody breaks a rule of logic, like they commit a fallacy or they change word definitions or something like that, specifically change word definitions in a way that you don't notice it, then discussion is no longer being held, as discussion is defined by the rules that govern it, like chess. But the question naturally arises from that, well, if we're not having a discussion, then what are we doing? By default, an interaction becomes one of domination and submission once you leave that realm of discussion. This is what I'm talking about when I talk of win-win versus win-lose interactions. So in discussion, two people submit to the rules of logic and through discourse are able to create a situation that's a win for both parties. However, if two people aren't able to discuss, then the only option left is fighting for dominance. Now, I've spoken of sophistry in other videos, which is the act of pretending to discuss while in reality attempting to dominate somebody. I believe, personally, that the fundamental reason that someone engages in sophistry, whether it's intentional or not, is to enjoy the benefits of dominating somebody without the risk of that person retaliating or attempting to defend themselves. And I also believe, usually 99% of the time, that the reason a person doesn't fight back in this sort of situation is because they still think they're having a discussion. They still think they're playing chess. And the sophist is able to accomplish this sort of situation by creating something that appears to be a logical discussion. It appears to be a logical argument, as opposed to, someone who's just an outright bully who just comes out and insults you or pushes you around, which obviously makes it makes the situation obvious that it's not discussion, that it is domination and submission. So understanding these rules of discussion, the point is to strengthen your muscles of intellectual self-defense, because it will begin to help you identify sophistry. And of course, once we can identify a problem, we can do something about it. Now, this shouldn't come as a shock. The tool needed for the line of reason is logic. However, before I get into an exposition about the virtuous qualities of logic, I want to explain why this video is going to be different from, I'm guessing, any other video that you've seen on this subject. So the first thing I want to point out is that logic is very dry, the subject of logic. And when I say dry, I mean like watching the grass grow boring. So maybe it's because by definition logic is devoid of emotion, but every resource I've ever stumbled across on logic requires some serious stamina to stay focused on. So my goal here is to make this conversation as light and as relevant as possible, so you can stay engaged. And I mean, at the very least, I don't want you falling asleep at the wheel while listening to this. So the second point, then probably the more important point, is that I will not be taking an academic approach to this subject. Anyone who's ever gone to a university will know what I'm talking about when I say this, which is academic subjects have a tendency to teach you the entire scope of a subject while forgetting to teach you why you should care about the subject to begin with. So knowledge for knowledge's sake is usually just taken for granted in university. This video is knowledge for practicality's sake, as I mentioned before. I want you to immediately take this information and put it to use. So what I'm going to be explaining here is actually my own distillation of the book, The Trivium. There it is. The Liberal Arts of Logic, Grammar, and Rhetoric by Sister Miriam Joseph. This was written by, obviously, a nun, and it was back in the 30s, and I actually don't really recommend reading it yourself, as her style is, I think the best way I could put it is medieval and maybe brutal. If you think other resources on logic are dry and boring, this one is like a whole new level above that. So you could kind of say that this video is a version of Sister Miriam's book that's understandable to those of us who aren't Catholic scholars. So the book, as I just read, it explores grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which together are known as the Trivium, which sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about here. Because when most people talk about logic, what they actually mean is grammar and logic. And we can understand why this is the case when we analyze the three individual components of the Trivium. The first one is that one acquires knowledge. These are the individual facts that we observe in nature. Thus, this knowledge is referred to as grammar. Second, once we've acquired knowledge, that is the individual facts that we observe in nature, we can recognize patterns in this knowledge to acquire an understanding of it. This understanding is logic. Third, having acquired knowledge and recognized the patterns in that knowledge to form an understanding, we can relate this understanding to others as wisdom. This wisdom is rhetoric. Thus, grammar, logic, and rhetoric are also referred to as knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. So, let's start off with some grammar, shall we? In school, most of us learned that grammar is essentially a way to identify the different parts of speech. I think mostly so we could be tortured on weekly quizzes and tests and wonder why we would ever use this at any point in the rest of our lives. What they didn't teach us in school is that grammar is the tool by which we make basic observations and how we express knowledge and how we communicate ideas and formulate those communications. This is why we're supposed to know the parts of speech, because putting these parts together correctly is what allows us to clearly express thoughts and ideas. So when we break grammar down, we will see that the fundamental unit of grammar is the term, and the completed unit of grammar is the sentence. Now, for sake of simplicity on this video, we're gonna scratch out the word term and write the word word. In the book, the Trivium, Sister Miriam Joseph actually differentiates between a term and a word, and she does so in a way that's a little bit metaphysically awkward. So for the sake of this video, we're just going to take the word to be the most fundamental unit of grammar, because I don't want to get into a discussion of metaphysics. Again, this video is supposed to be practical. So a word, we're looking now at that most fundamental unit. What is the word? A word consists of a subjective and an objective component, and I'm going to use some examples to elaborate. Sentence number 1, Jane married a man. Sentence number 2, man is a monosyllable. Sentence number 3, man is a noun. Now, if we look at this first sentence here, what it does is it exemplifies what Sister Miriam Joseph calls the first imposition. Don't necessarily remember these fancy sounding words. The first imposition exemplifies the objective nature of words, that is, the real thing being denoted. Jane didn't marry a frog. She didn't marry a house. She married a man. So in order to understand this sentence, we have to understand what a man is. That is to say, the objective thing we're calling a man. In the second sentence, however, you'll notice we don't have to understand what the word man means to understand the sentence. This is because this sentence objectifies the subjective nature of a word. That is, the phonetic symbol chosen to denote the objective thing being described. Sister Miriam Joseph calls this the zeroth imposition. I'm not entirely sure why. However, in this sentence, as long as we, whatever word we use is one syllable, the sentence makes sense. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a word. It could just be some sound. As long as that sound has one syllable to it, the sentence is fine. Now, in the third sentence, it ties these two components together, the subjective and the objective component. Man as a noun requires us to both recognize the phonetic symbol chosen to denote man and to know what a man is in order for us to understand and recognize that it's a noun. This applies to all parts of speech and is supposed to be why learning these parts is so important to us. By understanding these parts of speech, we can come to understand the objective nature of every word and the subjective components of how any people with any particular language choose to denote and arrange these words so they can communicate with each other. Sister Miriam Joseph calls this the second imposition, and the subject of grammar is supposed to be the science of the second imposition. Now, at this point, we already have our first line of defense against sophistry. The most important thing to take away from grammar is that the act of speaking itself refers, or at least attempts to refer, to something objective. To speak without at least attempting to refer to something objective is simply to make noises. If I say mrat or zwiggle or frick, all these things can be phonetically symbolized, but anyone and everyone instantly recognizes that they're not words. They're not referring to anything. Thus, super important, speech implies reality. And a primary tactic of a sophist is to obscure reality by being slippery with word definitions. Thus, to have a firm grounding that words refer, or at least attempt to refer, to something real is your first great defense against bullshit. In fact, I'll say this, when you come across your next, shall we say, sophisticated experience, chances are you're actually going to find the sophist criticizing the very idea that speech refers to something objective. He might say something like, well, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, or there's your truth and my truth, or that, like, perception is reality, man. These are all attempts to disconnect what you've said from reality, which is essentially an attempt to remove the power from your words. So, what I found, at least, if you call a person out on this, or very simply be insistent on the objectivity of your words, you will have the wonderful, and I mean wonderful, opportunity to watch somebody who is generally cool and collected completely lose it. I've seen this over and over and over again. The sophist knows that as long as he can convince his victim that words don't have any real component, he can never be called out. If the fundamental unit of grammar was the word or the term, the completed unit of grammar is the sentence. And no, I'm not here to bore you with the rules and nuance of putting a sentence together. I'm just going to very simply state that a sentence requires a subject and a verb, and often will contain an object. The subject does something to the object, and that does something is the verb. So the carpenter builds the house, the couple goes for a walk, or the unicorn drives the car. These are all examples of taking individual words and forming them together to create a full idea or a full observation. Now, with the unicorn example, I made that one specifically because I wanted to point this out. We instinctively understand that a unicorn is something that's not real. Grammar actually doesn't have any problem with this. As long as your imaginary concepts follow the rules of grammar, everything is okay. But wait, didn't I just explain that words refer to something objective? Unicorns aren't objective, they don't exist. I don't want to get into a metaphysical argument on this video about the nature of what it means to be objective or to be real or to exist, because, as I mentioned, I want this to be a very practical video, not an academic one. However, for the sake of practicality, I'm going to suffice to say that even though unicorns don't exist, you knew exactly what I was talking about when I said the unicorn drives the car. So even though unicorns don't exist, the word unicorn is fundamentally different from one of the meaningless utterances that I uttered without meaning earlier. The idea of a unicorn driving a car is communicated. So this is why philosophers will obsess over definitions. If we're not clear on what we mean by when we use words, there's no way we'll be able to communicate with each other. What's important about the word unicorn is that we both understand what is being referred to before discussing it. If we both agree that a unicorn is a mythical beast, which is essentially a horse with this single horn protruding from its forehead, and maybe has some other mystical qualities, then we're both on the same page for objectively communicating it to one another, despite the fact that it doesn't exist. It's time to move on to logic. So as we discussed with grammar, grammar looks at individual facts and concepts and observations and forms them together to make a completed unit of grammar, which is a sentence. Once we begin to compare these individual facts and completed sentences, we can recognize patterns. At this point, we've moved on to understanding. Logic is this understanding. Now, the way that we connect individual pieces of knowledge to form understanding is accomplished with the fundamental building block of logic. So just as we had a fundamental building block of grammar, which is the term or the word, logic also has a fundamental building block, which is called the syllogism. So this word literally means to bring together reason. In the study of logic, there's a famous syllogism, actually, that almost everyone gets exposed to. I'm sure you heard it before, to discuss this topic, and I guess I'll keep up the tradition here. So what we're going to start with is two observations, which are actually two completed units of grammar. They're sentences. So we got one is that Socrates is a man. Two, all men are mortal. And then we come to the third sentence, therefore, Socrates is mortal. So in these first two sentences, which are, like I said, completed units of grammar, one can, or I should say could, observe that Socrates is a man. You can do this just by looking at them. We could also observe that men are mortal. Even if you've never seen anyone die, the observation of the upper limit on a person's age is enough to know that no one's immortal. However, if we were looking at a living Socrates, we would have yet to see him die, so how can we know that Socrates himself is mortal? So we'll need to look at the grammar of the sentence to figure this out. So first, let's identify the terms within these sentences. So if we go back to our 3 sentences here. We got 1, Socrates is a man. If I say Socrates is term A, man or men is term B. We see term B again in sentence 2, and then we see mortal, which I'm going to say is term C, which ends us in sentence 3 with A and C, Socrates and mortal. In these first 2 sentences, there's a common term, B, which is man or men. This term acts as a bridge that connects the 2 sentences in a ratio. That's a very important word. A is to B as B is to C. The common term man is this thing that's connecting Socrates A and mortal C, and this is what allows us to extract the understanding in the final sentence that A relates to C. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. If you're mathematically minded like I am, this relationship actually behaves similar to a fraction. If we have A over B as B is over C, then the B's actually kind of cancel themselves out like you're multiplying fractions, and we end up with A over C. So this is actually a ratio, and this is why we use the word rational to describe something that's ratio. The application of ratio is what allows us to extract understanding from individual pieces of knowledge, which is to say, that ratio is what allows us to use reason. Like, if we go back, we've got the 3 sentences. Like the first 2 I said were completed units of grammar. They're basic observations. Now, the extraction that we're able to take out of these basic observations by connecting the 2 with this bridge, the common term, which is man in this case, allows us to extract a 3rd sentence of understanding. So in kind of a sense, you could say the first 2 are knowledge. The first 2 sentences are knowledge, and the 3rd sentence is understanding. This is this breakdown, the way I'm doing it, this is the syllogism, and this is how we connect pieces of knowledge. And as I mentioned before, this is the fundamental unit of logic. What's the completed unit of logic then? Why, of course, it's the argument. And the argument has no upper limit on size constraints. People can write volumes of books in order to make an argument. And to be clear, I'm not using the word argument that most of us have been brought up to use it in its colloquial sense, which is to have a verbal fight. I'm using it in its original sense of logic, which is to provide legitimacy to a point through the use of syllogistic reasoning. Now, because the syllogism is the tool by which we generate understanding, a valid argument is simply one that, if you broke it down patiently and properly, is nothing but a long string of syllogisms. And in order for an argument to be valid, this necessarily must be true. In fact, it only takes one syllogism to be wrong in a string of syllogisms to invalidate the entire argument. I mean, it's like a broken link in a chain. If one link is broken, then the whole chain becomes useless. Now, of course, nobody talks like this. Nobody makes an argument like this. We would never, ever, ever be able to communicate if we attempted to do this, because we'd be too busy writing out strings of syllogisms. In speech, much of what we communicate is actually just assumed to be understood. So, for example, if I were to tell you to get out of your house because it's on fire, I just take for granted that you're able to connect the dots and figure out that the reason that you should get out of the house is because that fire is dangerous to you. I don't need to break that down. So, this is actually why one of the reasons that discussion and making arguments and using reason is so difficult, because on top of the difficulty of putting together an argument that makes sense, we have to gauge what set of assumptions another person has in order to even form that argument. Even without exposure to anything I've spoken about so far, people innately understand that in order to show that somebody's argument is invalid, you just have to find one part of it that doesn't make sense. Now, as I mentioned, to do this is simply a matter of finding a place where one syllogism doesn't work. Now, there's actually two main ways that this can occur. There's a grammatical way to I screw up or break a syllogism, and there's a logical way to do it as well. So let's look at two examples to illustrate this. So I'm going to be playing with that same Socrates syllogism. So if we take sentence number one, Socrates is a man, starting at the same point, and then we say two, all men are mortal, same thing, and then we extract three, therefore all men are immortal. Well, this is so stupid it's obvious that it's invalid. The understanding extracted using the tool of the syllogism is exactly the opposite of what's observable in these first two sentences. This is an example of a logical error where the third sentence does not follow from the first two. And this is what we call improper syllogistic reasoning. Now, the error in this first example is going to be quite a bit different from the second example. So let's start with the same sentence. Number one, Socrates is a man. And then we go to number two, all men are immortal, which brings us to three, therefore Socrates is immortal. Now, what's interesting about this one is there's no logical problem with it. There's no logical error. If we broke down everything into the A's, B's, and C's like I did before, our ratio would come out just fine. The problem here is actually a grammatical one. No one has actually made the observation that men are immortal, meaning this syllogism is working with bad raw material, which is a grammar issue. No one has made that observation. That knowledge has never been acquired. Now, to break a syllogism, as I've done in both of these examples, is called a fallacy. So we can have logical fallacies and we can have grammatical fallacies, but however it's done, this is exactly where we're going to find the line between reason and dominance. I want that to be bold in your mind. I want that to be flaring out with red lights and sirens and stuff. This is the whole point I'm getting to. That this is the exact line. When we look at the syllogism, and if there's some way that we can crack or break or screw up the syllogism, this is the line of reason. And because it is through the syllogism that we utilize reason whenever anybody makes a fallacious argument, they are no longer using reason. The interaction now has potentially become win-lose or one of emotional domination. And I really can't overstate the importance of this. If valid syllogisms are required for discussion, that means if an invalid syllogism is committed, then by definition, the discussion must be irrational. We're no longer using ratio. If you break the rules of logic, you're being illogical, and if you're not following the rules of reason, you're being unreasonable. Now, I want to be very, 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 very careful at this point because it is so easy to create a false dichotomy out of this description I've given of rationality and irrationality. So I've just claimed that someone becomes illogical the moment they violate the rules of logic by incorrectly formulating a syllogism or working with bad raw material. While this is technically true, there's obviously more nuance to discussion than this statement would otherwise suggest. Using reason and formulating syllogisms is actually quite difficult, and no one is perfectly rational. In fact, discussion itself is predicated on the fact that you will make errors in your reasoning, and the other person should point these errors out. The point of this would naturally be to give you the opportunity to improve your argument. Now, if this is the case, that errors should be pointed out and that a person naturally is going to make errors, then identifying this line of reason isn't nearly as cut and dry as I just made it out to be. Therefore, a basic framework for discussion naturally must include a rational method for handling a fallacious argument. This is that method. So, during a discussion, in the event that one side points out fallacious reasoning to the other, there are 3 responses available to the person who purportedly committed the fallacy that will maintain a reasonable interaction. So someone supposedly makes a fallacy, the other side calls it out. These are the 3 things that person who supposedly made the fallacy did that will keep the interaction win-win. So the first one is that the person admits their error, the person who supposedly made a fallacy, admits the error and adjusts accordingly to modify his argument. The second option is that the person admits their error and concedes that the argument is invalid, thus changing his mind due to better reasoning. The third is that the person who supposedly made this fallacious argument actually successfully defends his point, showing that indeed it was a valid argument and the challenger's reasoning is fallacious. The challenger then is faced with these 3 options himself. So if this chivalric, I'll call it, behavior is kept up by both sides, which can theoretically go on forever, the interaction is considered to be reasonable or win-win. Now I want you to contrast these 3 options to someone that, when challenged, a fallacy is, someone has pointed out that they have purportedly committed a fallacy, they become hostile or passive-aggressive, they change the subject, maybe they become evasive, maybe they even use more fallacious reasoning, or maybe even they flat out ignore what you said and move on. These are the signs that you're dealing with a sophist and that you're possibly in a dominate, submit, or win-lose interaction. Another indicator that I've personally noticed, and I'm sure this will resonate with you as well, is that a skilled sophist will often actually go on the offensive and accuse you of engaging in this list of win-lose behaviors that I just mentioned. This, of course, is a form of psychological projection, and the goal here is actually is for the sophist to keep you on the defensive, explaining why you aren't being manipulative instead of pointing out that the sophist is being manipulative. Now, against someone who has no understanding of grammar and logic, this trick, this psychological projection of accusing the other person of committing the manipulative tactics that you yourself are committing, is actually a remarkably effective tool of manipulation itself, as it keeps the victim too busy defending himself against the accusations to have the mental space to analyze the situation and identify the sophistry. However, once you and I really mean this, once you achieve a rudimentary grasp of these ideas, it's going to be like a veil is lifted from your eyes, and you're going to see little self-important assassins and tyrants just scurrying around everywhere. They will be in shock once you've discovered their cover is blown, once they've discovered that their cover is blown around you, and will very quickly scurry off to somewhere else or to someone else that their low-level nonsense will be effective against. In addition to explaining rationality in very black and white terms, I've also been speaking of sophists in a very similar fashion. That is to say, a sophist is someone who breaks the laws of logic while attempting to hide that fact, whereas someone who follows the laws of logic is not a sophist. This is totally an oversimplification that I'm making because it's actually necessary to discuss the topic. When I talk about someone being a sophist or not, what I'm doing is called polarizing a spectrum. Obviously, every individual person that makes up the mass of humanity doesn't individually fall into the category sophist or not sophist. These are actually 2 poles on a spectrum. It would be more accurate to talk about someone being more or less likely to engage in sophist behaviors, or to engage in these behaviors more or less often. So, if we were to define these 2 poles of sophist and not sophist, as a sophist being someone who engages in sophistry 100% of the time, and a not sophist being someone who engages in sophistry 0% of the time, I think we would be hard-pressed to find a single individual on Earth who fit that non-sophist description. Although, I bet we could think of a few people who fit that sophist 100% of the time description. So, the problem with a spectrum like this is that it would be an impossible task to actually use it to measure someone's sophistry level. A person can slide around on a spectrum like this depending on all sorts of stuff. Like, I mean, it could be their mood or their stress level, who they're talking with, making it super difficult to assess, how sophist is this sophist. So, thus, for the sake of communicating these ideas, I'm going to continue using the term sophist in a very polarized manner. I need to spend some time on this video discussing the subject of intention. I will fully delve into the subject of intention in my chain of responsibility video, but I need to give it at least a cursory explanation here. And the reason is because intention is the number one objection I receive when I discuss this topic in private conversation. And the objection usually goes something like this. Well, yes, Dylan, sometimes people can falter in their reasoning, and sometimes it can come across as manipulative. But what if they didn't mean it? What if they were doing the best that they can? If someone didn't intend to be manipulative or malicious, can you honestly say that this person is engaging in an effort to dominate you? Let me be unabashedly clear. I am unequivocally, absolutely saying that yes. What's important to understand about intention is that it doesn't affect the nature of these interactions. Just because someone didn't mean to do something doesn't mean they didn't do it. Furthermore, they are still responsible for their actions even if they didn't intend to do something. This is actually well established in the realm of law. If I take my car out and begin driving recklessly for fun, and I'm like looking for bumps in the road to see if I can catch some air, and in the process, I lose control over the vehicle and I smash into an oncoming car and kill the driver, whether or not I meant to doesn't change my responsibility for doing it. Now, before someone jumps up and mentions this, yes, the intention does change my what my punishment would be. This is why there are multiple degrees of murder and a classification for killing people called manslaughter. The difference between these crimes, of course, is the intention of the criminal, and from my understanding, the punishment of the criminal is gauged, the punishment based on the intention of the criminal is gauged on their future threat to the community. So, I mean, for example, a person who recklessly drives and kills somebody has a lower chance, at least theoretically, of killing someone in the future, presumably because he didn't actually want to kill that person and he's going to learn from his mistakes and adjust his driving behavior accordingly in the future. On the other hand, someone who premeditates and maliciously carries out a murder would have that higher likelihood of doing it again in the future because he knew exactly what he was doing. However, for the driver of the vehicle, all this talk of intention is completely irrelevant because he's still dead. Likewise, while the intention of the person slipping into sophistry tactics may not be to dominate you, he's still doing it anyway. His intention may change your strategy on how to deal with him in a similar way that the intention of the guy driving the car, in my car example, may change his punishment in the realm of law, but the result to you is the same. You're going to have to deal with sophistry regardless of the person's intention. Okay, I got all that stuff out of the way. So, the sophist manipulates you by pretending to be reasonable. That is to say, they act as if their syllogisms are valid when they aren't. In a world of people who have no understanding of these things, a sophist can pretty much reign supreme because no one can identify what they're doing. There are actually two reasons why people can't or don't identify what the sophist is doing. And the first one typically is because they don't actually recognize that they're being bullied. As we've discussed before, people don't really understand the rules of reason. So they get in a place where they start getting defensive and they don't really know why. The second reason is actually a little more nefarious, which is that anyone watching any particular interaction involving sophistry, if I'm watching a sophist try to dominate somebody else, those other people usually don't understand the rules of reason either, and will often blame the person defending themselves against the sophist as the person starting the fight. Thus, when you're trying to, like if you get in a situation and there's multiple people and someone comes and plays their bullshit games on you, if you try to defend yourself, there's a very, very high likelihood that everyone's going to blame you for starting that fight. So peer pressure is a real thing to take into consideration when we're talking about this subject. But by understanding logic, and as I'm about to argue, more importantly, understanding grammar, we can attempt to defend ourselves, first to defend ourselves by identifying this, and help to defend others when they get in this situation, so they can actually have backup, and not everyone blames them for starting a fight when they were actually just defending themselves. And this is the point where I think, I haven't seen anybody else doing something like this. This is the point where I'm going to differ very much from studying logic somewhere else. Typically, when we get to this point of the logical explanation, we went through grammar, we went through the syllogism, and we went through building arguments, you would start talking about different fallacies and how to identify these different fallacies. Now, the different fallacies are honestly just different ways of screwing up that syllogism, just different flavors. And even if you're not well versed in logic, you've probably heard of things like a straw man fallacy, or a poisoned well fallacy, or a moving the goalpost fallacy, the ad hominem fallacy, which is, insulting a person instead of dealing with their arguments. I'm not criticizing the memorization and understanding of these fallacies. In fact, I think having a rudimentary grasp on these fallacies is vital to understand a working understanding of logic. However, there are a plethora of resources on fallacies on the internet, and I'm not going to waste my time or your time by trying to reinvent the wheel here. Furthermore, and more importantly, I actually don't believe that the memorization of fallacies is enough to have a good grasp on logic, or at least a good enough grasp to be skilled enough to catch sophistry in real time. So I find the understanding of grammatical fundamentals of the syllogism is what allows for dynamic intellectual self-defense. So, in the presence of a potential sophist, instead of running through a list of dozens of fallacies in your mind trying to identify what's going on, all you need to do is actually identify one invalid syllogism. Now, earlier I showed how all fallacies break down into two categories, which is either they're a grammatical or a logical fallacy. It's not always the case, but typically I found that logical fallacies are easier to spot. Grammatical fallacies, on the other hand, can get quite a bit more tricky. Now, in the earlier example I gave, my grammatical fallacy, which is the all men are immortal fallacy, it was easy to spot because it was ridiculous, and I made it ridiculous so we could have something to analyze where the error was clear. But typically a grammatical fallacy is not going to be obvious at all, and in particular, I find that sleight of hand with word meanings are really what make the most insidious and hidden fallacies hideous. I think that applies as well. To understand this better, let's look at what's called the fallacy of equivocation. So consider the following example. 1. The syllogism. 1. Or a bad syllogism. Feathers are light. 2. Light is the opposite of darkness. Therefore, 3. Feathers are the opposite of darkness. Now, again, this is so silly it's stupid. It's obvious that there's an error here. In the first sentence, we see light as something that has a relatively low mass, and in the second sentence, we see light as a definition being a form of electromagnetic energy. In this case, both words have the same subjectively chosen phonetic symbol, but they have wildly different. They refer to wildly different objective concepts. Now, in our day-to-day lives, this is actually an incredibly common fallacy to stumble upon. And it's usually when the meanings between the two phonetic symbols, or when the two different meanings between the same phonetic symbol aren't so clear, like this goofy one right here. This is a perfect opportunity for the sophist to ply his trade. If we aren't clear on the objective things being referred to, we give others an opportunity to define the words for us. So the word I want to look at this is my pet peeve word, is actually the word discipline. This is where we're going to see how this can get nasty. So when I was growing up, this was a common word that I would hear from my mother. Even after I graduated the household, I would hear it from other parents referring to their own children. And that would be, a child needs to be disciplined because he wasn't doing what he was supposed to, presumably because the child lacked discipline. The usage of this word always bothered me because I felt that it was just a sly excuse to treat somebody badly. And it actually turns out that there's some pretty sloppy grammar at play when it comes to the word discipline. So, first and foremost, discipline is actually a verb, a noun, and an adjective. And let's look at the different meanings of these three forms of the word. First, the verb to discipline essentially means to punish, if you've ever thought about that. And more specifically, it's to punish someone who wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing. I used to be disciplined for not doing my chores, and furthermore, the word kind of has a corrective connotation, which is to say punishment for the purposes of reinstilling discipline into the transgressor. Now, when discipline is a noun, like I just used it right there, the meaning is quite a bit different, and to have discipline means to commit oneself to a regiment or a routine or some sort of strict behavior through the use of one's own willpower. Now, I mean, for example, I go to the gym every morning at 5 a.m. or 5 a.m. before work because I have discipline. What's interesting about the noun is that there's nothing about it that implies punishment or corrective measures. It's simply a quality that reflects one's own determination. Now, the adjective, disciplined, like she is disciplined, has a very similar meaning to the noun, which is that it applies commitment to something through one's own willpower to essentially have self-control. Now, this whole situation between the verb, the noun, and the adjective is completely ripe for a fallacy of equivocation, as the tenses, particularly for the adjective and for the noun, for the adjective and the verb, can overlap. So, if we look over here and we say, okay, let's take the present tense of the adjective and we see that she is disciplined. This is present tense adjective. If we make this a past tense adjective, it becomes she was disciplined. If we look at the verb and we take the active tense of the verb, let's say, okay, her mother disciplined her. If we take the passive tense of that same verb, it turns into she was disciplined. The phonetic symbols between the adjective, the past adjective and the passive verb are exactly the same, and they have completely different meanings. I mean, if I say little Jimmy was disciplined, you would have no idea if he was just punished by his parents or he just had it in him to make his bed every morning. So this chaotic mess of grammar created between the noun and the verb and the adjective of the word discipline honestly, it can confuse the best of us. And we can be manipulated during this confusion. This is what's so important. And if we're unfamiliar with the nature of words, the fact that there's this objective quality and subjective quality, and they're not necessarily, just because we have the same subjective pronunciation doesn't necessarily mean we're working with the same objective concept. If we are unfamiliar with the nature of words, then we are completely defenseless against someone who would use a word like discipline to convince us that being orderly and masterful is actually the result of being punished or being hit. And again, I bring this word up because it's so prolific. Even when I was in Austria, the word for discipline in German is very similar to the word in English. It's disziplinieren, and they use it they were using it in a very similar fashion, which is one can be diszipliniert, someone can be disciplined, or I can discipline somebody. They got the same issue between the verb, the noun, and the adjective. So this word, the misuse of this word is so pervasive, it extends to other languages and cultures. So let's look at an example of how this word can be used to manipulate or dominate somebody. So I wanted to look at two syllogisms, and so 6 sentences. So the first sentence is, a disciplined person makes their bed every morning. The second sentence, I did not make my bed this morning. 3, therefore, I'm probably not a disciplined person. Now, if we take this third piece of understanding that's extracted from our 2 observations, we can actually use that as our first piece of knowledge for our second syllogism. So we got sentence 4. I'm probably not a disciplined person. Sentence 5. People should be disciplined. Therefore, sentence 6. Somebody should probably discipline me. So what's happened here is we've gone into this situation with one meaning of the word discipline, and we where's my hand? Came out over here with another meaning of the word discipline. So, and if you weren't clear on the 2 definitions of the word discipline, you might not catch this slip. And the sans punishment definition of discipline, you know, the one that just says, okay, I have willpower, is maintained all the way until sentence 5, and then suddenly we switch into adding punishment into sentence 6. So, again, the reason I've chosen to focus on the word discipline isn't just because, you know, slight variations can be difficult to catch, is that one of the meanings literally implies punishment, and obviously punishment implies domination. So to accept a fallacious argument such as this one, you can actually be agreeing to be punished. So in a very literal sense, this is to agree to be dominated by somebody. And I can't over exaggerate this, is that people do this sort of word meaning switcheroo manipulation crap to each other all the time. And in fact, I would be surprised if you were listening to this now and didn't immediately start coming up with your own examples. In fact, when I was talking to a friend about this in private conversation, he did immediately come up with one of his own examples. And I think everyone must have like their own pet peeve word when they hear about something like this. And the word that he brought up was regulated. And he was bringing it up in the context of the Second Amendment, which of course refers to a well-regulated militia. So there's an anti-gun argument that goes something like this, which is that, look, even within the framework of the Constitution, in the Second Amendment that you gun nuts hold so dear, it implies that there should be regulations. It says a well-regulated militia. Well, the meaning of the word regulation in the Second Amendment, or regulated, the objective quality to the phonetic symbol, isn't to have statutes and legislation and bureaucracy controlling the ownership and use of firearms. Regulated in this sense actually means trained. A well-regulated militia is a well-trained militia. So a militia that's well-trained, they've got their weapons and powder organized, they know who's in charge, that they're familiar with their surrounding terrain, and they train regularly. That's where the regulated comes from. They train regularly. So the reason that the fallacy of equivocation is the only one I'm analyzing in this video is because I think it's the most fundamental fallacy that one can commit, and it's possibly the most difficult one to recognize. And if you don't have a firm grasp on grammar, these 2 examples, for example, discipline, you may agree to be punished, or regulated, you may agree to some tyrannic legislative capacity by some group that want to take your freedom away. They look like 2 validly perfect syllogisms, or both situations look like they're formed with perfectly valid syllogisms. Now, when I've spoken to people about this information, like my friend that I just talked about now, as I said, they usually start coming up with their own examples quite quickly. And I think the reason that everybody is so familiar with this, to the point where they come up with examples as soon as I start talking about it, is that on a subconscious level, people recognize that they're getting backed into a corner when someone does this word meaning switcheroo crap on them, but they don't know how, and they don't know why. So in an attempt to defend themselves, let's go back to my 6. Oh, here's my hands. Over to my 6 sentences on the discipline fallacy that we came up with, what people will normally do in this sort of situation is they'll actually try to defend themselves from sentence 4 or sentence 5. So, for example, in sentence 4, they might say something like, hey, just because I don't make my bed every morning doesn't mean I'm not disciplined in other areas. Or maybe against sentence 5, they'll say, well, maybe not everybody needs to be disciplined so much. Now, once this occurs, the argument has actually shifted to whether or not someone making their bed every morning means that the person is disciplined, or how disciplined a person should be in general. And if you're dealing with a sophist who gave you this bullshit to begin with, if you maintain that level of defense, it's not long before they're going to hit you with something very similar to this and keep you on the defensive until you capitulate. The real issue here that needs to be addressed is the transition between, here we go, 5 and 6. What do you mean by discipline? Tell me what you mean by discipline so I can understand what you're saying. This question will stop usually a lazy sophist right in their tracks. And this by a lazy sophist, I generally mean probably someone who's not intending to do it. But a more skilled sophist will usually try to distract you with some other argument, often something like, well, it's obvious what discipline means. How can you not know? And even in the latter case, to focus singularly on the issue of the definition of the word discipline and not let the guy move on, and trust me, they're going to try, will completely change the dynamic of the interaction utterly and immediately. And man, I've seen this over and over again. A sophist will often try to make such a big deal over the fact that you're making such a big deal over this tiny little thing. It's just one little word. You see all these words and all these sentences? You're upset about one of those little words. Man, you make such a big deal out of small things. Talk about making a mountain out of a molehill. Huh. Well, Mr. Sophist, that word is the big deal. And because the entire meaning of the argument hinges on that one word, that is the most important word in the whole argument. And so if you're hyper-focused on this sort of thing, I find that it even stops a skilled sophist, and they're going to hesitate in the future to pull crap like this on you. Building a defense against manipulation starts with learning to recognize when you're being attacked in the first place. Because manipulation, as I keep saying in my videos, is simply a form of domination, whose qualifying difference between other forms of domination is it's sneaky, it's designed not to be recognized as dominance. The reason I painstakingly, in this video, broke down things into their fundamental grammar and syllogistic components is because this is the most basic method for identifying good and bad arguments. You can't get more fundamental than this without going into epistemology and metaphysics. So, to defend yourself against manipulation, you must have at least a rudimentary grasp of these ideas, because they are what make you able to identify manipulation, and what you can't identify, obviously you can't do anything about. So, I want to be clear. What we've discussed so far in this video, it's not enough for you to have a full grasp on logic. You're going to need to study more. Particularly, you're going to have to learn about categories, even to form syllogisms. There's a special thing in logic, understanding what categories are and how they interact with each other, and at least some of the more common fallacies. However, whenever you're unsure about the validity of an argument or whether you're potentially being manipulated, you can always fall back on what I've spoken about here. This grammatical syllogistic method, this ability to identify the line of reason, or as we'll be talking about in future videos, this ability to identify the 3-2 slip, kind of acts as a catch-all. This will catch all bad arguments. If you come across an argument that smells bad and you can't quite figure out, what specifically fallacy is going on, you could always fall back on this. Now, the problem with this method is that it's actually really slow to employ. So, when we're emphasizing grammar, when we're emphasizing this technique, which uses grammar to clarify word meanings, obviously you have to know what word to apply it to, and also obviously in the course of communication with others, we can't define every single word we're using the whole time. I mean, we need words to define words, and we just make a bigger problem the more and more we spoke. So, in a very similar way that we can't spend our time making long strings of syllogisms in order to make arguments. There's a level of assumption that has to go between the two parties. So, thus, in the application of this method, we need to learn what words to focus on. And this is a bit of an art and will take some practice, but learn to listen to the words that people emphasize, that they repeat often, or use very quickly and move on to something else. And you'll also want to learn to become sensitive to your gut reactions. So even if our heads don't understand reason very well, our guts understand it perfectly. And they will do everything to let us know when something comes up. So this is your intuition. And personally, if I ever feel anxious or notice myself defending my actions in a conversation, the feelings that come up from that let me know to pay a little more attention to what's going on in the interaction. Now, this isn't to say that anytime you feel anxious or anytime you have an emotional reaction that you're being manipulated, but learning to tap into this intuition can train you to notice indications from yourself that you should be paying more attention, and then that you might want to start applying more of these head thinking level strategies. So, some other strong indicators of sophistry, I've mentioned a few of these already, are during the course of discussion, a person becomes defensive, passive-aggressive, outright aggressive, behaves as if you're stupid, talks down to you, or my favorite is they become exasperated or impatient. Like, oh, I can't believe I have to go through this. He's making me define these words. What a moron. I just can't even with you. Or as we mentioned, they act as if the words of, or the definitions of words are obvious without actually defining them. These are the sort of the things that you need to know that you should stop trying to play chess. You should stop trying to have a discussion. You need to switch your strategy for what's going on. And further study and practice, as I just mentioned, is essential at becoming adept at intellectual self-defense. And when I created this YouTube channel, this was one of the main things in my mind that I wanted to talk about. And as I mentioned, becoming with common fallacies is a must, and the classical study of logical help. But like I said before, I find these things to be rather slow and clunky and academic. And so the presentations that I've been making have been designed to give you a very practical and streetwise method of identifying this bullshit and coming up with ways to deal with it. So my future presentations, the 4 circuits of human interaction and the chain of responsibility, they will be potent tools to help you speed up. And when I say speed up, I'm, like I said, this is a very slow method. Even though it acts as a catch-all, it's kind of a method of last resort once you learn the other stuff that I'm going to be going over. Because I want you to be able to start speeding up and recognizing not just bad arguments, but manipulative arguments at the drop of a hat. So you can, I guess at the very least, not waste your time dealing with bullshit sophists. But in a more advanced sense, remember when I talked about the peer pressure? Where if you attempt to defend yourself against a sophist, everyone's going to blame you. You need to be able to work inside that framework more quickly, where if you've got multiple people bringing you bullshit, and you've got to discern where the bad arguments are and how you're going to talk to these people, you have to very quickly deal with those people too. So speed is of the essence here, and my intention is to be able to get you to speed up. And these two other presentations, the 4 circuits of human interaction and the chain of responsibility, are tools that I specifically designed to help speed up your ability to do just that. Wrapping this all up, because I think this video is starting to get a little bit long. As I've mentioned multiple times throughout the video, all I've spoken about here is identifying manipulation. Haven't, or at least very little, discussed what you should do once you've identifying it. That is a discussion of strategy. Now, to act as if I could adequately discuss strategy in the small section, or in a small video, short video, would be akin to saying I could adequately discuss martial arts in the small section of a book. The attempt would be ludicrous. And furthermore, there's no one thing that you should do for strategy. This, the question always comes up when I talk to people about this. They say, okay, I was in such and such a situation. What should I do? Or what should I have done? And it's, I can talk about what I think I would have done, but there's no way to prescribe what you should do. Just like in a physical fight, there's no way for someone to say, okay, if I was in this situation and this person was over here and he was this big and he was about to do this to me, what should I do? There's nothing I could say to you that would help you in that situation. You would actually have to train for it. So, logic and intellectual self-defense is very similar, and every interaction is going to be different and is going to require you to act on your feet, and you're usually not going to have any time or very little time to analyze details. It's not like, we have some traditional style debate where you get your 5 minutes or something to take down notes and think about it and come up with a reply. These things happen very quickly. So, in addition to that, fighting isn't the only strategy either. I know people seem to get that feeling from me that fighting is the only thing that I'm coming up with to deal with what I'm calling sophistry and what I'm describing as manipulation. Maybe that comes off from my character, but I want to be clear that that's not the only option on the table here, and that's certainly not the only option that I work with. In fact, you could choose to run away, or just walk away. One of the questions that I always ask people when they talk to me about this is the situation even worth your time? If you're pumping gas and some guy on the other side of the gas pump starts yelling at you or criticizing you or something, is it even worth your time to care? On the flip side of that, a situation might actually be dangerous. Particularly in the case of a child dealing with an abusive parent, and it may actually behoove you to pretend to continue being reasonable. Keep playing the chess game, knowing that you're doing so in a dominate submit interaction, just long enough to fool the other person that you can get away. Now, regardless of the strategy you choose, there's always I always have to say at least this. One thing that you shouldn't do, which is to continue being reasonable. Once you identified that the person is breaking chess rules and knocking pieces around the board, stop playing chess. Do not continue to try to play chess. Don't try to come up with better moves. Don't try to come up with better arguments. Don't try to say, okay, well, I'm going to bring in more facts. I'm going to start bringing in statistics. I'm going to be more sophisticated. You're wasting your time, and you're playing into the sophist's game because he knows he has you, and he can just sit back and watch you spin around in circles and eat up all your energy when it applies 0% to the actual interaction, which is, it's a fight. So, unless, as I just described, you're faking it, whatever you do not be reasonable back to a sophist. You will lose by default. Now, your first line of defense against sophistry is understanding grammar, as I've been talking this whole video. And when you grasp this, it's like your eyes will be opened for the first time. People around you that you thought you can converse with will suddenly show themselves to be inconsiderable jerks. Friendly people you will discover to be shameless mooches, and you will also find, this is the hardest part, you're also going to find that some of the closest people in your life have been using words to extract your energy like a gluttonous vampire. My goal with this video and the other videos that I'm making is to give you the tools that you can either end, avoid, or improve your relationships. And I understand this is more than likely going to be a very, very painful experience. Refusing to be manipulated by a sophist is something akin to like taking food away from a dog. They're going to defend themselves accordingly, if you know what I mean. This process of changing your relationships is going to include the radical change of developing new and more healthy relationships, and I promise it'll be totally worth it to you in the end. So stick it out and enjoy the results, and we'll see you next time.